that my family, my father built.
Divine legacy is more than bricks and mortars.
I wanted to save Gotham. I failed.
Why do we fall, sir? So that we can learn to pick ourselves up.
What does it mean to be a hero? To be a symbol? To fall down and get back up? These are the questions that burn deep inside Bruce Wayne. The questions presented throughout Batman Begins, Christopher Nolan's 2005 cinematic retelling of the origin story of one of the most iconic comic book characters ever written. Before many superhero films started to become carbon copies of themselves, there was a golden age in these comic book movies. Films that focused more on the core characters than those before them, and less on the money than those after them. The likes of include the original Iron Man film, Sam Raimi's 2-film Spider-Man trilogy, and of course, the holy grail of superhero movies, Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy. These films all have a unique feel about them, all with different narrative, stylistic, and cinematic qualities to be respected. Upon rewatching many of these films recently, I found myself more drawn to Batman Begins than any of the others, including its revered sequel, The Dark Knight. While The Dark Knight may be seen by many as an objectively better film, there is something about Batman Begins that cannot quite be matched the same, and that is the story of Batman. Not Batman, the masked vigilante, but Batman, the symbol, the story of Bruce Wayne becoming Batman.
People need dramatic examples to shake them out of apathy, and I can't do that as Bruce Wayne. As a man, I'm flesh and blood. I can be ignored, I can be destroyed, but as a symbol, I can be incorruptible.
Not only did this film kickstart one of the most beloved movie trilogies of all time, but it also helped lay the groundwork for future superhero movies and blockbusters in general. And much of this comes down to the unique choices that the filmmakers made, taking the familiar tale and artistically adapting it to contemporary times through a neo-noir lens. The resulting film is one that is centered in realism, feeling more like a classic film noir than a traditional superhero movie. It is very easy to undermine the significance of this choice, but when looked at holistically, this is what allowed Batman Begins to tell us a more meaningful story about what it means to be a hero.
I never said thank you.
And you'll never have to.
Superhero movies have become something of their own form of filmmaking in recent times, more popular than ever before. It is sometimes hard to see from the success of this genre today that these films were once treated primarily as 2-hour-long ads to sell toys to kids. But audiences and filmmakers have slowly come to respect and appreciate the comic book source material and this new form of media entertainment, which is why we now have this.
You screw with me now, just a little bit, and you'll never really be with your one and only Vanessa ever again.
Rather than this. But as much as I would like to see more of the kind of filmmaking and storytelling present in the Daredevil Netflix series, much of the superhero films of today have become more and more of the same. The launch of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and DC Extended Universe have built up bigger audiences and fan bases than any other franchises before, and with no lack in money, they will continue to produce movie after movie. And while this isn't necessarily a bad thing in and of itself, as others have pointed out, it becomes a problem when these films occupy the spaces in every cinema, leading us slowly towards the death of, ironically, cinema itself. But Batman Begins shows us that it is possible to have a successful superhero movie that is also meaningful in its story and storytelling, something that Martin Scorsese would consider real cinema. As opposed to the Batman films that came before it, the creative team of Batman Begins decided to take a more grounded, realistic approach over the traditionally fantastical and campy style of comic book stories. These previous iterations of the Batman story saw the character take on a stylistically heightened Gotham City, as in Tim Burton's interpretation, even sporting a Bat credit card and suit complete with nipples in Joel Schumacher's interpretation. Although the first of these is gritty in tone, both interpretations retain the campy comic book feel. These films, and other superhero films of this time, were primarily invested in stylistically translating the feeling of a comic book to the screen. This is where Batman Begins differs, crafting a unique style in support of the substance of the film, focusing more on what it is about Batman's story that is so important. This led the film into one particular genre, noir. Unlike previous interpretations of the character, Nolan's film places its focus on Bruce Wayne, who is fundamentally a traumatized detective solving crimes and fighting injustice. Most of the film is devoted to exploring the psyche of Bruce and cinematically examining how the mantle of Batman is a coping mechanism, thus finding itself centralized on the elements of dark psyche and crime that define both the narrative and stylistic elements of neo-noir.
Forget it, Jake. It's Chinatown.
This contemporary interpretation of Batman solidifies itself as one different to any before it, focusing on how the style could meaningfully elevate the story of the film rather than just following the expectations associated with such an intellectual property. To examine the influence of film noir on Batman Begins, an understanding of the aforementioned genre is crucial. Film noir, however, is a concept that is easy to identify but difficult to define. It is rather unique in that it can be considered a film style, movement, and genre simultaneously. While there is no singular definition for film noir that critics can agree on, Nolan's films often have an undeniable noir aspect. In Memento, for example, the noir character tropes are all too recognizable. The film features a flawed detective lead in the character of Leonard Shelby trying to solve the murder of his wife, whilst the character of Natalie acts as the femme fatale, an undeniably noir characteristic. While this doesn't appeal to the conventions of noir as explicitly as something like this, the inherent influence is undisputable. But Batman Begins takes this one step further. Though designated rules of the genre may vary greatly, the British Film Institute even narrowing it down to a checklist, Nolan posits that the core of noir, and thus neo-noir, is the exploration of contemporary fears. As Nolan puts it, to many people, film noir has become this nostalgic image of guys in raincoats and fedoras coming down alleyways, but when you get back and look at the films, you realize they were very contemporary stories imbued with exaggerated, everyday fears. Nolan's definition aligns with the origin of the movement itself. Noir films have historically come in waves, addressing dark views of the world stemming from the fears of the people in the time and place they originate, generally following national tragedy. The first wave of film noir emerged during and in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War and acted as reflections of the fear and paranoia of the time, and for obvious reasons. These films were imbued with a gritty realism, often reflecting the fears of the time through the vessel of crime and detective narrative tropes. In the case of Batman Begins, like many films truly of this genre, the influence of noir is inherently interwoven through the social and cultural context of the world during the production. Specifically, Batman Begins acts as a response to the events that transpired on September 11th, 2001. Fear of terrorism and war were receiving the peak of attention within the cultural zeitgeist, and when the film released 4 years later, the ramifications were still being seen and felt worldwide. This is reflected in Nolan's plot, following a foreign militia group using a weapon to spread fear and destruction in Gotham, a city designed to be a crime-ridden version of New York. Meanwhile, Batman uses repurposed military technology to fight back against these enemies. The film replaces domestic terrorism for a literal fear gas, reflecting a time of national uncertainty. With the main villain's scheme being to destroy Gotham through fear, and Bruce Wayne assuming the mantle of a symbol of his own fear, the film distinctly reflects a post-9/11 world. Thus, due to the dire context of the world surrounding its production, Batman Begins was able to use film noir to innovate on the superhero genre in a meaningful way. This moves past simply the plot and into the actual techniques employed in the film. The camera work leaves a deep effect on the film's overall look, making use of characteristic noir chiaroscuro lighting, with its stark contrast between light and shadow to elicit emotion and build atmosphere, accentuating darkness by eliminating fill light and emphasizing key light. Distinct noir lighting is used to cast dark and foreboding shadows, creating a sense of constriction. Objects often dominate the frame and bring a sense of isolation to the regularly half-illuminated characters of the film. The editing only accentuates these techniques, with a tendency to cut away from the light and hold on the darker, more tense shots. We often see very little visible action, instead opting to use sound design and cutting at the highest point of action to a quiet reaction. All of these techniques harken back to the earliest waves in the film noir movement, echoing throughout the film's runtime and helping to cinematically build the world and its tone. However, what I think is even more significant is how the character of Bruce Wayne is positioned within this framework. Being that the film is the origin story of Batman, the film focuses heavily on how Bruce has been led to this time in his life. In order to achieve this, the film makes use of jarring flashbacks, detailing the events of Bruce's early life, including the defining interaction that leads to his fear of bats and subsequently the death of his parents. Though exposition-heavy flashbacks such as these are often considered lazy filmmaking, they make perfect sense in the context of the film. They help construct the complex and multifaceted character of Bruce Wayne, showing us where his anger and guilt spawned. We view fragments of the past in a way that enforces the encroaching miasma of darkness. The resulting film is one that is engulfed in shadow, the visuals reflecting the dark subtextual exploration of the instability of happiness and the inescapability of fear. It is this world and tone that Nolan has built through Noir that allows for the character to develop the way he does. The dark and gritty backdrop of Gotham City provides a believable landscape for Bruce Wayne's story to unfold. Whereas previous superhero movies, Batman films in particular, were showcases of colourful villains, Batman Begins centers itself on Bruce Wayne, looking deeper at the effects of such a story on the man behind the mask. In fact, we don't even see the character of Batman in his recognizable cape and cowl until about the 1 hour mark of the film, because the film instead devotes its time to building the character of Bruce Wayne, his internal conflicts, his drive, why he is the way he is. The filmmakers let us resonate more with the story because we can empathize with its protagonist, setting it apart from many of the superhero films that came before it. We see clearly the struggle of Bruce Wayne and how he becomes trapped between his two selves.
Rachel, all this, it's not me. It's inside. I am more.
Bruce, deep down you may still be that same great kid you used to be. But it's not who you are underneath. It's what you do that defines you.
As the film progresses, we don't just watch Bruce Wayne parade around as Batman, we watch Bruce Wayne become Batman. We watch him overcome his psychological hurdles and learn the difference between justice and revenge. We witness raw character development that probably wouldn't have come about if it weren't for film noir. The realism that the film opts for is perfect for such a flawed character, determining the grounds on which for him to grow. So when we reach the end of the film, having witnessed this character channel his internalized anger and guilt into becoming the one thing Gotham needs, it is all the more fulfilling.
Wait! You could die. At least tell me your name.
It's not who I am underneath, but what I do that defines me.
Bruce?
As can clearly be seen, the superhero genre has no shortage of an audience, and while this is partly due to such companies as Marvel and DC capitalizing on what fans want, it cannot be the only reason. We as a society clearly have a strong draw and connection to these films because they enact the fantasies that everyday people aspire to. They are the stories of everyday people becoming extraordinary. But Batman Begins is different because Bruce Wayne is just like us, trying to enact the same fantasy for himself. He may be rich, but why he takes on the mantle of Batman is to fulfill his own desire to become more than just a man, to live up to his father's legacy by making Gotham a safer place. And while there is a triumphant end to the plot, Bruce Wayne never truly finds himself, instead becoming lost in the symbol of Batman.
The man I loved. The man who vanished. He never came back at all. But maybe he's still out there somewhere. Maybe someday when Gotham no longer needs Batman, I'll see him again.
It is this true duality of man that Batman Begins explores so poignantly through Noir. The symbol of Batman gives Bruce the means to fight injustice in such a dark and broken world, but also to discover what it means to be a hero, to overcome fear and face the challenge of making the choices that no one else can make. Batman is a symbol for all of this, and Batman is all of us. It really doesn't matter who he is or who you are underneath, because it's what you do that defines you.